Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, talking about 10 albums you must hear before you die. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So this is something I saw going around on YouTube. Oh, it was probably a couple months back I saw it. And when I decided to do my own video, it actually took me a while to sit down. I didn't want to just kind of ramble off the same albums that, everyone else has talked about, Dark Side of the Moon or Thriller or any of those like really big albums. I tried to find things that aren't as common but are equally as great as a lot of those other albums. I wanted to represent multiple genres with this and multiple decades also. I've got albums going all the way back to 50s to today, and I think every decade is represented except for the 2010s, I think. So I started getting into jazz probably about a decade ago. And when the first time I heard this album, this was one of those albums that, outside of like the big John Coltrane albums that were, I think the first jazz album I listened to was A Love Supreme. But once I got past like those really big albums, Miles Davis, started getting into some other jazz albums, the first time I heard this one, I absolutely fell in love with it. And today it's still one of my favorite jazz albums of all time. Now, I've talked about it a few times on the channel here. This Soul Station by Hank Mobley. This was released back in 1960. I think it's kind of widely regarded as Hank's like big signature masterpiece. It was recorded over one magical day in 1960 with Art Blakey and two of his other bandmates that he worked with the Miles Davis Quintet, which were Wynton Kelly and Paul Chambers. All four of them would record incredible albums across their careers, but I don't think anything quite equaled what they did on Soul Station. I think this is also kind of widely seen as one of the essential hard bop albums of that era. It's melodic and soulful and in a lot of ways less aggressive than what a lot of other jazz musicians were doing around that time period. That's an album that if you were looking to get your feet wet in jazz music, I think is a perfect place to start. So I've been a big Social Distortion fan for, probably well over 30 years now. And then when Mike Ness would release his debut solo album in 1999, Cheating in Solitaire, I thought it was very different than what he was doing earlier in his career. I think Cheating in Solitaire, in my opinion, is probably one of the most underrated albums of the entire decade. It's a fantastic mix of rock, country, Americana, rockabilly, all kind of rolled into one album. He's also got a couple of big guest appearances on this album. You've got Brian Setzer shows up on here, so does Bruce Springsteen. And it's got a couple of the best cover songs of the entire decade in You Win Again by Hank Williams and Don't Think Twice by Bob Dylan. The interesting thing about this album is some of these songs were actually written for Social Distortion's 1996 album, White Light, White Heat, White Trash. They ended up going unused, and Mike sat on those songs until he started working on a solo album. Johnny Cash was even scheduled to make a guest appearance on this album, but because of health reasons, he had to back out. If you're a like old school outlaw country fan, if you're a rockabilly fan, this is definitely a perfect album to check out. So going in a completely different direction with this next one. In 1993, Hum would release Electra 2000. Hum would gain some fame with their next album, You Prefer an Astronaut, which I think overall is a better album than this one. But the style is different from this album to the next one. With You Prefer an Astronaut, it's definitely more of like a straightforward like shoegaze kind of album. But with Electra 2000, it had this kind of rough, almost like I compare it to like an early Nirvana grunge sound, which I think is a completely different side of Hum than what most people know of the band. And while I wouldn't really classify this as a grunge album, I think it's really the closest thing that Hum would ever get to doing grunge music. It's got this raw, dark, minimalistic sound to it, which, is largely what Nirvana was doing on Bleach. So I think there's a lot of similarities between Bleach and Electra 2000. The first thing I ever heard from the band was You Prefer an Astronaut. So when I started going back and listening to this, I was really kind of surprised the difference in sound between this album and the next. The next album was recorded way back in 1957, but it was never released until 2005. And that was Thonius Monk and John Coltrane at Carnegie Hall. It was a live recording from two of the titans of jazz music. And this legendary album was thought to be lost to time. And then in 2005, I think it was like a clerk going through Library of Congress and just stumbled across these tapes. So John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk started playing together in early 1957. I think there are some recordings from earlier that year, But by the time they got to Thanksgiving, which is when this performance was, the chemistry between the two was absolutely undeniable, and it really comes through on this recording. In 1961, they would record a studio album together, but they were just never able to recapture, I think, what they did on this performance. Not only is it one of my favorite jazz recordings of all time, it's probably one of my most played albums over the last 8 to 10 years. When people think about Bob Marley, I think they think about those big albums, like Legend, which is the greatest hits compilation, or Exodus, or Natty Dread, or Kaya. But I think the best album from him also ended up being his last album, which is Uprising from 1980. It was the last album before his death in 1981, and a lot of people look at this as kind of a farewell album that Bob was writing to his fans. Of course, Redemption Song is the big track off of this one, but there's so many other great ones on here. You Could Be Loved is another classic Bob Marley track. But you could go down through the track listing and pick almost any song. But this is Bob's most directly religious album also. And I don't know if it was due to, him knowing that he was near the end of his life, or if that's just kind of the way the album rolled out. But this is a very uniquely Rastafarian reggae album. And then when you get to the end of the album, the very last track is Redemption Song. I think what makes that song so special is the stark contrast between it and the rest of the album. Listening to that song, it's almost like peeking into the soul of Bob Marley. And that's why I've always looked at that one song in particular, as kind of his farewell song. And then on to a much happier note, released in 1995 is Pezcore by Less Than Jake. This is a raw, fun, energetic ska punk album, and never received the widespread recognition as a lot of other albums, even albums from Less Than Jake. Losing Streak and Hello Rockview were much bigger albums than Pezcore, but I think the influence that Pezcore had would really lay the foundation for what not only Less Than Jake would do in the 90s, but really anyone in that genre. The album also includes 2 classic Less Than Jake songs that would be re-recorded for Losing Streak and actually get more popularity with Losing Streak, but the versions of Johnny Quest Thinks We're Sellouts and Jen Doesn't Like Me Anymore, I think the more raw sound there is on this album, I think actually lends better to those 2 songs. And this album is a quintessential ska punk album before ska punk got bought up and commercialized by the mainstream. And then going back to jazz, this album was recorded in 1959, but wouldn't be released for 20 years. And that is My Conception by Sonny Clark. This is a posthumous album that was released after Sonny's death. I think this is kind of widely seen as one of the more creative albums from jazz in those early 50s and 60s years. And it was Sonny's soulful jazz style that would help transition or transform jazz music from what it was in the 40s and early 50s to what it would be throughout the rest of that decade, and really through the end of the 60s also. Sonny didn't put out a whole lot of music before his death at 31, but My Conception, I think, really stands out as his masterpiece, with Cool Struttin' probably a really close second. But like a lot of other jazz releases around that time period, Sonny was really good at putting really good musicians around him. Because on this album, he's joined by Hank Mobley, Kenny Burrell, Paul Chambers, Art Blakey, Donald Byrd's on here also. It's a beautiful album to just sit down and listen to. The next album is this is probably one of the more unique sounding albums that's been released over the last probably 10 or 15 years. That's also the newest album on this list. But this is Crime Wave by Codefendants. This was released in 2023. Codefendants is a supergroup put together by Fat Mike of NoFX, Sam King from Get Dead, and Chesky Ramos. It's a genre-bending album of rock mixed with punk and hip-hop, indie rock, even a little bit of folk is in this album. There's a lot of themes on this album of injustice and addiction, things that all 3 of those members have gone through over the years. It's emotional and narrative and poignant in a lot of ways that most albums today really aren't. Coda and Suicide by Pigs are probably 2 of my favorite songs on this album. It's really kind of, at least the way I look at this album, is almost like a 2020s version of a protest album. The only other album on my list that was released in the 2000s is New Wave by Against Me. It was released in 2007. It was critically acclaimed for not only its energy, but also its ambition. It was produced by the legendary Butch Vig. Butch worked with Nirvana. He worked with Smashing Pumpkins, pretty much every big band from the 90s and early 2000s. And the reason I put this album on the list, I think this album really showcases the transition that punk went through in the late 90s and early 2000s into this more accessible style of punk rock while still maintaining a lot of the quality. And then once you got more into the 2010s, I think punk rock, or that version of punk, really got watered down, commercialized by the mainstream. Really all they ended up doing on this album was they took their sound and gave it a little more of a polished edge. it ended up being Spin Magazine's album of the year that year. And then the last album I got on my list of the 10 albums I think everyone should listen to before they die. It's released in 1971, and that is Metal by Pink Floyd. This is the true transition album for the band. This is where they would go from what they were with Syd Barrett to what they would do really with Dark Side of the Moon and everything else in the 70s. The album starts off with the song One of These Days, which has this menacing kind of atmospheric sound to it. And this is the album that I think Pink Floyd not only found their sound, but really found their direction. It's progressive, it's bluesy, it's psychedelic, it's really everything that was going on in rock music in the late 60s and early 70s, all packed into one album. And the album closes with the epic 23-minute long song Echoes, which, at least in my opinion, is probably the greatest progressive rock song of all time. I think it was also a really great bookend to what they did with One of These Days to kick off the album, where, I think that was a great pick to start the album because it really kind of set the pace for the rest of the album. And then Echoes, which is the entire second half of the album, kind of wraps everything up into one song. And not only is this probably Pink Floyd's most underrated album, I think it's one of the most underrated albums of the 70s. Whenever anyone talks about the greatest albums of the decade, I think this album really belongs at the top with all those other great ones. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think are the 10 albums or some of the albums that you think everyone should listen to before they die. This was a really hard list for me to put together because there was so many albums I wanted to put on here. I really just had to sit down and decide, kind of rank them 1 through 10. Now, none of these are really in any kind of order, but these ended up being what I thought were the 10 best from my list. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. And that's all I got. On to next time. Keep on spinning. Peace.